In the Middle Ages, adultery was not just a betrayal of love, it was a crime, and the punishments were brutal. Women had their heads shaved and were forced to march half-naked through the streets. Men and women were locked in wooden frames, mocked and pelted with stones. Some were branded with hot irons, others whipped until their backs were raw, and in the most extreme cases, adultery led to death by hanging, drowning, or even fire. For medieval society, marriage was sacred, and breaking it was seen as an attack on family honor, religious law, and public order. That is why punishments for adultery were not only about pain. They were staged to humiliate, to scar, and to terrify everyone watching. This is how adultery was punished in the Middle Ages. For most people caught in adultery, the first punishment was not death, it was humiliation. Medieval society thrived on public shame. To betray one's marriage was to betray the entire community, and so the guilty were paraded as examples. One of the most common punishments was the pillory, a heavy wooden frame locked around the adulterer's head and hands, fixing them in place in the town square. They could not move, could not defend themselves. The crowd took care of the rest. Rotten vegetables, stones, insults, and spit rained down. Sometimes the punishment lasted hours, and even if the victim survived without serious injury, the memory of their shame lived forever in the community. For women, the loss of hair was almost as devastating as any beating. In medieval culture, hair represented dignity, beauty, and sexuality. To be shaved bald in public was a mark that could not be hidden. Every passerby would know this was an adulteress. The humiliation lasted long after the punishment ended, until the hair slowly grew back. Another common punishment was the walk of shame. Women were forced to march through the streets in only their underclothes, surrounded by jeering crowds. Sometimes horns were strapped to their heads, symbolizing cuckoldry and ridicule. The crowd mocked, laughed, and hurled objects. The punishment was psychological, meant to strip away every trace of dignity. Some towns used iron masks forged into grotesque shapes, donkey ears, pig snouts, or twisted faces. The masks were heavy and painful, forcing the wearer into silence. Some even contained spikes inside, cutting the tongue if they tried to speak. These humiliations were not about justice in any modern sense. They were theater, punishments designed to scar reputations forever. In medieval towns, shame was often worse than pain. To be mocked, marked, and remembered as an adulterer was a sentence that lasted a lifetime. Public shame was often only the beginning. In many places, adultery also carried physical punishments, brutal acts meant to hurt the body and leave visible scars. One of the most widespread punishments was flogging. Men and women alike were stripped to the waist and whipped in front of the community. The lashes tore the skin, leaving bloody welts. Sometimes the punishment was combined with the walk of shame. The guilty marched through town as each strike of the whip echoed against stone walls. The message was carved into their flesh. Adultery would not be tolerated. Another punishment was branding. Executioners pressed red-hot irons against the flesh of adulterers, often on the face, chest, or back. The wound left a permanent scar, a lifelong mark of dishonor. No matter where they went, people would see the burn and know their crime. Branding was not only physical torture, it was a way of making punishment permanent. In some regions, particularly where local laws were strongly tied to religious codes, adulterers could be stoned. Crowds gathered, armed with rocks, and hurled them until the guilty collapsed. Sometimes the goal was death, but often it was survival through suffering. The victim battered, bleeding, but alive, a warning to all. Certain communities went even further with punishments designed to fit the crime. For men, this could mean castration. For women, it might involve cutting off the nose or ears, disfiguring them so they would carry shame forever. These punishments were rare compared to flogging or branding, but the fact that they existed shows how deeply adultery was seen as a violation of order. Physical punishments ensured that adultery was not forgotten. Scars, burns, missing flesh, all served as permanent evidence of betrayal. Pain was temporary, but the mark of dishonor was for life. Not every adulterer was whipped or mocked in the town square. In certain times and places, adultery was considered so serious that the ultimate punishment was demanded: death. These executions were rare compared to public shaming, but when they occurred, they were remembered for generations. One of the most common methods was hanging. A simple rope could end the life of a guilty man or woman, often in full view of the community. The condemned was marched through the streets, jeered at, then taken to the gallows. For men, especially when adultery involved dishonoring a noble family, hanging was considered a fitting punishment. The act was swift, but its meaning was heavy. Adultery destroyed not only a marriage, but the order of society itself. In Germanic and northern regions, women in particular were drowned for adultery. They were tied, sometimes placed in sacks, and thrown into rivers or lakes. The symbolism was striking. Water washed away the sin, but also silenced the guilty forever. To onlookers, the slow disappearance of a body beneath the surface carried a lesson more powerful than words. Perhaps the most infamous form of execution was burning. Women accused of adultery were sometimes tied to wooden posts, surrounded by straw and kindling, and set alight. The flames rose slowly, consuming flesh while the crowd watched. Fire was seen as purification, destroying both the body and the sin. Often, accusations of adultery overlapped with witchcraft, and the two charges blended into one sentence of fiery death. What united these punishments was their spectacle. Executions were never meant to be private acts of justice. They were staged dramas where the condemned body became a message. The smoke of the pyre, the creak of the rope, or the splash of water was not only the end of a life, but the beginning of a warning. A single execution could keep an entire community obedient, far more than laws written on parchment. These extreme punishments were not everyday occurrences, but their shadow loomed large. In the Middle Ages, adultery was not just betrayal. It could be a death sentence, and one carried out with maximum fear. Adultery in the Middle Ages was not judged equally. The punishments we have described, pillories, whippings, executions, were real, but who suffered them depended greatly on gender and status. The law was written to protect marriage and honor, but in practice it was deeply unequal. For women, adultery was seen as a direct attack on family honor. A wife who strayed threatened not only her husband's pride, but also the legitimacy of children and inheritance. Because of this, women were punished with far greater severity. A simple suspicion could be enough to shave a woman's head, parade her in public, or even condemn her to death. The humiliation of women was also more visible, being stripped, branded, or forced to wear masks of shame. Their bodies became the stage for punishment. Men, on the other hand, often escaped with lighter penalties, if they faced any at all. A husband's infidelity was rarely treated as a crime. Visiting prostitutes was tolerated, sometimes even regulated by towns. Only when a man's adultery involved dishonoring another noble household or offending the church directly did he risk real punishment. Otherwise, society looked the other way. The hypocrisy was even clearer at the top. Kings, princes, and nobles frequently maintained mistresses openly. Their adultery was not punished, but celebrated, sometimes even used to forge alliances. Queens and noblewomen, however, lived under constant surveillance. A queen accused of infidelity could be disgraced or executed, as her children's legitimacy directly affected dynasties. The balance of punishment leaned entirely on power, not morality. The church preached harshly against adultery, but within monasteries and convents, scandals were often covered up. Priests and monks who engaged in illicit relations were sometimes quietly transferred rather than exposed. Once again, public spectacle fell hardest on the powerless, while the powerful escaped under the cloak of authority. This double standard reveals the truth of medieval justice. Adultery was less about the act itself and more about who committed it. Women and commoners bore the full weight of punishment, while men of power walked free. The system was not only brutal, but deeply hypocritical. Looking back today, the punishments for adultery in the Middle Ages seem almost unimaginable. Public shaming, whippings, and even executions were not only accepted but expected. Yet these practices reveal much about medieval society and why they fascinate us still. For medieval communities, adultery was not a private matter. It threatened family honor, inheritance, and religious order. That is why punishment was public. It was not enough to punish the guilty. Everyone had to see, remember, and fear. The shaved head, the iron mask, the scar from a hot iron. These were lifelong reminders of a crime that society would not forget. Modern culture views adultery as a personal betrayal, often handled quietly. But in the Middle Ages, it was a crime against the entire community. This difference is striking. It shows how marriage was seen not as private love but as social duty, tied to faith and law. The fascination endures because these punishments were extreme and because they expose hypocrisy. Women carried the heaviest burden, while powerful men often escaped punishment altogether. The cruelty was not only in the punishments themselves, but in the imbalance of justice. When we remember these medieval practices, we see more than brutality. We see how fear, shame, and power worked together to control people's most intimate lives. That is what makes them disturbing even centuries later. Adultery in the Middle Ages was never just about love. It was about power, honor, and control. The guilty were mocked in pillories, their heads shaved, their flesh torn by whips and irons. Some were drowned, hanged, or burned alive. Others carried scars and shame for the rest of their lives. What stands out is not only the cruelty of the punishments, but the hypocrisy behind them. Women were punished harshly, while men of influence escaped judgment. The law of adultery was not blind. It was a tool wielded against the powerless, especially women, while protecting the powerful. Today, adultery remains a betrayal, but no one fears the whip or the stake. In the Middle Ages, love outside marriage was more than forbidden. It was branded, beaten, and sometimes burned for all to see.